There we go. Okay. We'll see if that works. Okay, so the organization of the presentation will discuss some of the background to Regulation 906. We'll give the legislative framework, and we'll deal a bit with designation and listing and how this regulation applies to designation and listing. Then we'll look at the groups of criteria that are in Regulation 906. So it's design and physical value, historical or associative value, and contextual value. And then there'll be some final words. And I apologize at the beginning, but many of the examples that I will be using are ones that I have been involved in at some time in my career. So before 2005, the Ontario Heritage Act said you may designate based on architectural or historical value or interest. So that was the phraseology that was used. So it was very much architecture and history, but there were no criteria given or guidance other than cases that may appear before the Conservation Review Board and in their rulings. So there was nothing in the legislation. There were no regulations. So municipalities were left on their own to decide about values. What did they value? And in Newmarket's case, this is what we did. So I was chair of the committee. This was from 1980 to 2000. And we looked at age, integrity, importance to the community. And then we always asked the last question, would you miss it if it was demolished? So those were our value systems. But City of Toronto had a numeric system. So they actually assigned quantitative values to various categories. And that was a joy to deal with, because when I became the senior coordinator at the City of Toronto, we had this numeric evaluation system, which was based on something that Parks Canada had put out in 1980. There you see the brochure, the evaluation of historic buildings. And on the right-hand side, you see a scoring sheet. And so this is a particular building, and it was given scores from 0 to 10. So you see those values down the right-hand side: history, architecture, visibility, integrity, and you came up with a final number. And if it met, the limit, it was considered worthy of designation. Some municipalities still have this. I deal with the city of Aurora, or town of Aurora, and they still use this system in addition to Regulation 906. But this system led to problems. It applies only to buildings. And we often ended up in court cases, whether the Ontario Municipal Board, the Conservation Review Board, and in one case, we ended up at the Supreme Court of Canada over these numeric values. And the lawyers would always get in there and argue, well, why did you give it a 5 and not a 4? So a great deal of time was spent arguing about why we did or did not give it that value. I had one employee who was excellent, who could really deal with lawyers on this issue, but she was an exception, and everybody else had problems dealing with it. And municipal councils also came up with a wide variety of evaluation systems. So there were problems prior to 2005. 2005, the Ontario Heritage Act was changed, and the wording of the act now says that you may designate based on cultural heritage value or interest. So it's a much broader definition, which before, as you might recall, was architecture and history. This is much broader. And you'll find it in the Ontario Heritage Act, Chapter 29, subsection 1, and it deals with designations under Part 4. And the Act also says you can only designate a property if where criteria for determining whether a property is of cultural heritage value or interest have been prescribed, the property meets the prescribed criteria. So the legislation is now saying it has to meet the criteria. You have to meet the prescribed by criteria. So this was 2005, and that's still in the Act. You will see it in there. And so you can designate a Part 4 property using the prescribed criteria. But right now, the Act for listed properties, so this is a property that's not designated, all you need is the location information. So if you've got a street address, according to the Act, that's all you need. So designation, prescribed criteria, undesignated listed property, all you need is location information. If anybody has a question, please jump in at any point, and I'll deal with questions as they arise.
I have a question, Wayne.
Sure.
So what you're saying is, if you want to list a building, you don't have to say that it is an Ontario cottage frame, story and a half, built around 1859, owned by the former miller of the community, none of that is required.
Under the current legislation, right. Now, your municipality may ask for more information, but right now, all you need is a street address. In fact, when the legislation was changed in 2005, City of Toronto was amalgamated. We had what, 6 municipalities. We ended up with inventories from Etobicoke, from Scarborough, from North York, where the only information we had was the street address. So we went to council and said, you know, list these properties. All we have is a street address. We were amazed that council listed thousands of properties all at once, just with a street address. City of Toronto has changed the procedure, and now before listing a property, they required more information. But the Act only says you have to have the street address. Now that's the Act as of 2005. And in 2006, the province came out with the prescribed criteria for municipalities. They proclaimed them in 2006, so that's why it's Regulation 906. There's also a separate set of criteria for provincially owned property. And you may have some in your municipality, and they're covered by Regulation 1006. They're quite different, and the provincial ones stress that it's of provincial interest, and it doesn't have to be of local interest. And in fact, if it's not of provincial interest, they won't protect it if it's provincially owned. So you got those 2 sets of criteria. Now, the legislation is being changed. In 2019, the Ontario Heritage Act was amended, but not proclaimed. So there have been amendments made to the Act, but they're not in force yet. It was intended that they come in force in January the 1st of this year, but the province has decided to delay implementing the proclamation of the new regulations and the new amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act. But Regulation 906 has not changed, so the criteria remain the same. However, for listing, as you asked, Valerie, municipalities will be required to issue a notice of a listing to the owner, including a statement explaining why the council of the municipality believes the property to be of cultural heritage value or interest. So the legislation for listing properties is changing. It hasn't changed yet. So for example, the city of Toronto in December listed hundreds of properties only by street address. They went back to their council and said, this is going to take us forever. Let us do this. We can do this legally right now. And they did it. But once this legislation is proclaimed, it's my interpretation of the act that you must show how a listed property meets the prescribed criteria. Now, you can add a qualification because you don't do a lot of research for listing a property. So you can add a qualification saying, pending further research, it may meet other criteria. So the criteria are important for designation. They will be important for listing. So it applies to Part 4 designations, and it will apply to listings, but not heritage conservation district designations. So here's the regulation. And I'm sorry, it's we'll get into it in more detail and it'll be larger, but it says a property. So keep in mind you're designating properties, not buildings, but properties. A property may be designated under Section 29 of the Act if it meets one or more. So it has to meet one or more of these criteria for determining whether it is of cultural heritage value. And the criteria are grouped into 3 groups. The property has design value, design or physical value. Number 2, the property has historical or associative value. And group 3 is the property has contextual value. And within each of those 3 groupings, there are subgroupings. So you'll see under design or physical value, the first one, it's a rare, unique, representative, or early example of a style, type, expression, material, or construction method. We'll go into each of those in detail, but each one of those categories, the groupings, has subcategories. And to be designated, it only has to meet one of those criteria, one of the subgroups. So you could say it is a rare example of a certain construction method. And that would satisfy the legislation for determining whether it is of cultural heritage value or interest. However, my recommendation is use as many of the criteria as possible because you may be contested on the criteria. And if one fails, you've got others that you can rely on. And you'll see this as we go through a number of the properties. So let's get into group 1, design or physical value. And the item subgroup I is a rare, unique, representative, or early example of a style, type, expression, or construction method. So representative of an example of style. Here's one in Caledon that I worked on, and it's a vernacular interpretation of Gothic revival. Vernacular, the word vernacular is often inserted in there to indicate that the design has been varied slightly to meet local conditions or the needs of the residents. So that's why vernacular is in there, but it meets Gothic revival. And in terms of style, how can you determine what style it is? There are many publications that you can use. I find the best one is by John Blumenson, and it's Ontario Architecture. and it's a guide to styles and building terms from 1784 to the present. Now, the present in this case was 2000, so it's 1784 to 2000. Parks Canada put out a number of publications over the years. I believe many of these are online now. And this one's on neoclassical architecture in Canada. So it goes into great detail and it gives examples of the various building types. Of course, you've got Harold Kalman's A History of Canadian Architecture in 2 volumes, and it describes architectural styles. You've got simple publications like this, an Architectural Styles Spotter's Guide. And again, this takes on an international perspective, but you can see how a style in your community might fit into these styles. And they do deal with things like Gothic revival, although they don't call it the Ontario cottage. And of course, you've got barns, various styles of barns. So all the previous publications dealt with non-agricultural buildings, generally non-agricultural buildings, but there are books on barns and the style of barns. So there's a lot to help you in determining whether or not it meets a particular style. And let's go back. In the case of the building on the left, which used to be on Highway 50 in Caledon, I took John Blumen's description of Gothic revival and compared the description, the details that he talked about should be in a building. And you can see it in this building in terms of the dichromatic brickwork, the center gable, the window types, the return eaves on the building, the chimneys. So you could go through that and check off many of the criteria. It's not going to meet all of them, but in this case, this building on Highway 50 met most of them. And for that reason, I said it was an example, representative example of that style. Now, I've recently dealt with one in London, Ontario, where I'm dealing with the building on the left. And this is what I found when I've gone out on site. I haven't been able to find any old photographs of the building. There's no material left under that modern siding. It had previously been ripped off and the new siding applied to it. So you can see the windows have been changed. A lot has been changed about this building. Whereas I went to elsewhere in London and I found examples of this Ontario cottage style. So my argument was that unfortunately the building on the left did not meet the criteria in terms of window detailing, even the presence of chimneys, siding on it. And there was nothing that I could find where it would be possible to restore it to what it originally looked like. Now, some people say if you find a photograph of the building, you might be able to restore it. The standards of guidelines for the conservation of historic buildings in Canada says only restore if you've got documentary evidence. I could not find any for this building. So even though it has the same massing, height, and roof shape as the building on the right, I've said, no, it does not meet the example or the requirements for Gothic revival. So a lot, I've conveyed a lot there, and it, having an old photograph really helps, or even older drawings of a building. So research is essential, but you can see, I hope you can see why I was saying the one on the left didn't meet the requirements, whereas the one on the right does.
Wayne, can I ask another question?
Sure. Yep.
If you had known that this building was built in 1850 and you had nothing else but that, would that have any weight in terms of listing or designating that structure?
Okay. Excuse me. Okay. Yes, as a matter of fact, this building on the left is listed in London's register. And in fact, you're right, it was built in the 1850s. I did do that research. But in my opinion, it's lacking a lot of the details. And despite the fact that it was built then, the interior of it has been completely gutted. There's nothing left on the interior that would even indicate that it was built in the 1850s. So, you know, I looked at other criteria. Does it meet other criteria in an attempt to say, is this building of value? But in terms of this one particular value, in terms of style, no. So you're looking at other criteria there. You said 1858. That would be an early example of a style. While there are early examples of the style elsewhere in London, and in fact, there are better styles. So this is the type of argument that you may get into when you're moving from listing to designation, and in this case, this is a development site. So the owner wants to develop this site. So if you haven't got good criteria, you could end up before the local planning appeals tribunal trying to justify a building that, in my opinion, is difficult to justify. But that's one criteria. We can look at others. Representative examples of type. Okay, so this is a Carnegie Library that I did in the village of Durham in Grey County. And this one was clearly an example of a Carnegie Library. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Carnegie Libraries, but Andrew Carnegie, the American philanthropist, and steel baron, gave out money to build libraries throughout the English-speaking world. And I think there were in excess of 50 that were built in Ontario that used Carnegie's money. But he had specific design requirements. This meets the design requirements of the Carnegie Library, but it also includes some idiosyncratic features that make this also a unique example of that style. So that's a style, the Carnegie Library style. Construction method. Okay, this is a house I dealt with in Georgina, and it's not something you can see on the surface. So this is one where you really got to research the building. And in this case, there was documentation that this is a vertical plank building. So there is no frame to this building. And you can see on the right-hand side, I don't know if my arrow shows up, but you can see it's built entirely of vertical planks. There's no frame to it at all. So this was an early building built in the 1850s when there was a lot of lumber available, cheap lumber. So, but it's a surviving example of that style. And that's the main criteria used in designating this building, that it's a vertical example. It's one of the few left in Georgina that anybody is aware of that is vertical plank construction. So that's type, construction method, style. Okay, unique examples. So we've dealt with representative examples. Unique. Unique means one of a kind. Okay, so we've got what I love to call the inverted cupcake in Toronto, the Roy Thomson Hall. And it is a designated structure. It's modern architecture. So it doesn't have to be 19th century, early 20th century. This one was built in the 1980s. And it was one of the few examples when I was working at the City of Toronto where the architect was still alive and phoned to complain that they were changing the seating arrangement in Roy Thomson Hall, and he didn't like that. So mostly I dealt with dead architects and they didn't complain about what was happening. But in this case, it was live, so you can designate, and it's definitely a unique example. I don't think you'll find another one. Similarly, the one on the right, this is an example of a type and construction method. Again, it's very modern. It was built in 2006, but in my opinion, it's worthy of designation. It's certainly unique, and it's deconstructive architecture. So you're actually seeing the structural elements in the building here. The Pilates are holding up this flying box. And the reason I got involved with it, not because at the time it certainly wasn't heritage, but you see these buildings down below, they were listed in the register, and we were concerned that they would be demolished as a result of this construction of this addition to OCAD. So this was a solution that the architect came up with to build the addition and keep the heritage buildings. And so you've now got two different styles of architecture on the same property. Rare and early examples. Okay, this is where we get into age. And okay, you've got religious architecture on the left. The Quaker Meeting House in Newmarket, built 1810. So it's very early religious architecture. This area was settled about 1805. So this is a very early building from that period. And then construction building. This is one I'm working on in St. Catharines, and it's industrial architecture built 1899. And it's actually represents a transition in the style and construction method of the building. And you'll see on the inside here, it's got heavy timbers, but it's got these iron posts. So they're actually composite iron posts. So this is a transition between heavy timber buildings and steel frame construction. So this was an early attempt to build up I-beams that you would use in steel frame construction using these composite iron posts. So there are actually four of them in making a single post there. Anyhow, it's a unique construction method. Okay, so we've dealt with the first criteria about design. Just to go back, a rare, unique, representative, or early example of a style, type, expression, or construction method. We now get into the second criteria, where we're looking at it displays a high degree of craftsmanship or artistic merit. So if you remember, I said the more criteria a property can meet, the better it is and more defensible it is for designation. And again, we come back to this building in your municipality. And I said the brickwork is a good example of craftsmanship. In fact, it's an excellent example. The brickwork on this building is phenomenal, and that it's survived in such good condition. So that's the exterior. I've also used it on the interior of a property. So this is a building on Yonge Street, Green Lane in East Gwillimbury. So it's near Sharon, and it's really great woodwork on the inside. And hopefully it's still vacant and won't get vandalized further. But you can see just from the door, the framing around the door, the box paneling, the side lights, the transom, and then the staircase. Just a beautiful piece of 1850s interior woodwork. Okay, so that was craftsmanship. The next criteria is it demonstrates a high degree of technical or scientific achievement. And this is the lift locks in Peterborough. And from an engineering standpoint, this is really a unique, so we go back to the first criteria, but it's a unique property. But the engineering design is phenomenal on this. So keep in mind, this was constructed around 1900. So that the engineering work, this lift lock, the fact that one section goes up and pushes the other one down, and the size of this thing, it's still the largest single lift lock in the world. And it also represents an early use of poured concrete. Although the Romans invented concrete, we in Canada, and in particular Ontario, didn't use it until the late 1890s, the early 1900s, because we were concerned about how our severe weather would affect concrete. So the engineer in this case found a way to pour the concrete, and it has withstood the test of time, and we now use it as a frequent building material in Canada. Okay, technical and scientific achievement. This is early steel frame construction. So if you remember, I was talking about the industrial building in St. Catharines that I was working on. It was a preliminary example of this building style. This one, in this case, the Robert Simpson department store in Toronto, was steel frame construction, because he built this building in 1894. It was timber frame construction, and it burned down almost immediately after he built it. So architects in Chicago were starting to use steel frame construction. So this one was built with steel framing with a veneer of brickwork and stone on the exterior being attached to the steel frame. Okay, so we've moved from design and architecture into historical or associative values. So this one is association, theme, event, belief, person, activity, organization, or institution significant to the community. So this is, the property has to represent a theme. And one of the ones that quite impressed me, we recently had an Ontario Heritage Conference in Sault Ste. Marie. And on one of the tours, we went to Algoma University, and Algoma has reused some buildings. And one of the buildings that reused was a residential school. And they have a room in there and an interpreter who explains what it was like to live in a residential school. And this was one case where a building really moved me emotionally because of what they experienced. And this is something you should keep in mind when you're listing heritage properties. You know, there may be bad things associated with the property, but perhaps the community should retain that building maybe readapt it, but retain it because it is a memory of what we shouldn't do in the future. So residential schools is one theme. My house pictured on the right is an early example of settlement of the land, European settlement of the land. In this case, it's a log cabin that was built in Georgina in 1837. So you've got two themes there: organization, belief, institution. So on the right, you have a church in Milton. This, although it was a replacement church built in the 1890s, the Presbyterians had been on this site since the 1830s. And so it's a continuation of their use of the property. It's still there. There's a cemetery associated with it. So religious organizations and beliefs can be important to justifying the historical or associative value of a property. On the right-hand side, you've got the Newmarket Town Hall and Market Building. Again, it's associated with municipal government in Newmarket. And in some of the buildings the municipal buildings I've dealt with, there have actually been plebiscites held to determine whether the electorate wanted to build the building, spend the money and build the building on it. So you've got, from the very start of buildings like this and the Carnegie Library that you saw earlier, the community was actively involved at the start of construction in determining whether or not they wanted the building. This is an interesting example about belief. And I was in Alice Springs in Australia. And as is my habit, I walk around and I found this site, and it looks like it's been a used construction site with slabs of concrete dropped there. But in fact, those are rocks. And there's a small interpretive plaque here. And this particular landscape, this individual property is part of the Aboriginal belief system. They didn't have a written language, so they explained the origins of themselves and of Earth through various landscape features. And this little mound here, which is shaped, when you look at it from on high, it's shaped somewhat like a caterpillar. This is the end of the caterpillar you're looking at. This was important to their belief system. And in fact, it's been set aside as a heritage site because of the connection with Aboriginal beliefs, and caterpillars were important in explaining the evolution of the landscape. So open up your mind to beliefs. There has to be some sort of continuation or explanation, a long-standing explanation for that landscape feature, but it can simply be a landscape feature. Okay, so here we're dealing with, we've moved on from theme, events, and beliefs to persons. And so we come back to this property in Caledon on Highway 50. And I found in researching the property that the second resident of this property, who had actually married the daughter of the first resident, was one of the first veterinary surgeons who graduated from the Agricultural College in Guelph, now University of Guelph. So he was one of the first veterinary surgeons, and he practiced in Caledon. So, you know, there's that association with a person. So already you're building up a case for the property on the left-hand side, looking at style, looking at craftsmanship, and looking at the importance of people who lived there. there. On the right-hand side is a building in Newmarket, and it was home, the childhood home to Mazo de la Roche in the 1890s. I hope you are aware, but in the 1930s and 40s, she was a very prominent and best-selling Canadian author. And in fact, she embellished her name because in fact, her grandfather, who operated a store on Main Street, he was Danforth Roche. And she decided she'd add a de la to her name. So anyhow, association with an author. Activity and institution. So this is another association. It can be associated with things like education. So this is the King George School in Newmarket. It was constructed in 1911. And notwithstanding the fact that my daughter went to kindergarten here, it does have heritage value in the community. The community went to great lengths to construct this school. It was a local school board that constructed it, and for a small village, a small town, this was a major investment. Interestingly, we got the town to designate it. The town wouldn't designate properties unless the owner agreed. This is back in the 1980s. So they wouldn't designate it unless the owner agreed, or if it was another level of government. And they were very anxious to designate this one, which is the Board of Education. So we didn't have to ask the board, the town just went ahead and designated, which is a good thing because the Board of Education has since declared the building surplus, and it's now being converted to residential use. So the building has been saved. On the right-hand side, another example in Newmarket, this is the land registry office. And land registration was an important activity. Knowing who owned the land was extremely important, particularly in the early part of the 19th century when there wasn't a lot of wealth except for land. People were land rich and money poor. So you wanted to know who owned it. So land registration was important. This registry office was built specifically to house the documents. It was built in the 1880s. And another case where it was owned by the region of York, and the town of Newmarket did not hesitate to designate this building without the consent of the owner. Another level of government. But again, it has become surplus, or it became surplus to the needs because although the region owned it, the province was operating the registry office, and registry office moved out. It wasn't big enough. And so it became surplus to the region, and they sold it to the town, and it's now the town museum. So good things can happen from designation. So this should be actually item 3, yields information that contributes to an understanding of a community or culture. And this is a difficult one. I've had examples where people have said, well, this farmhouse contributes to our understanding of farming in the area. And my response was, well, any farmhouse can contribute to our understanding. So you've got to have better reasons than that. In this case, the Quaker Meeting House and Cemetery is important for the belief system of Quakers in the community. And the monuments are very simple, so they speak to the simple style of Quakers. Now, Quakers lived simply, but they were not adverse to accumulating wealth. but they were not allowed to display their wealth. So even though they may have been wealthy, they had simple tombstones. And yet another interesting aspect to this is that in the cemetery, you were buried in the order in which you died. So the Quakers were being very systematic about this. So if a husband and wife died at different times, they could be in entirely different places in the cemetery. And then the meeting house itself is interesting because the meetings were divided between men and women, and there was actually a dividing board between the men's section and the women's section. It's still there, although they've now can raise it up. But the building itself speaks to their belief system at the time. So that's Newmarket and the Quaker Meeting House. At the right-hand side, you've got the Wellington County House of Industry and Refuge. It's now the Wellington County Museum. It's in Fergus, built 1877, but it speaks to the way we dealt with the extremely poor people. And these were houses of industry. So if you were poor because you didn't work hard enough. So you were placed in here and you had to work. In some cases, it was work the land or work in factories associated with the building. But anyhow, the museum, because the building is there, they have displays up that explain how people were treated in the building, how we dealt with our poor in the 19th century, which is an interesting story in itself. So that building contributes to our understanding of our community and culture at that time. So historical or associative value, work of an architect, artist, builder, designer, or theorist significant to a community. So this man on the left-hand side, John T. Stokes, has impressed me in my years of work. He was a multifaceted individual. He was the clerk treasurer of the township of East Gwillimbury. He, when the census was taken, and you look at census records in the 1851, 1861, he was frequently an enumerator for the census. He was an architect, he designed buildings, and he was an engineer. And he ended his career as the county engineer for York County. But he was a prolific individual, and he designed numerous buildings. You can see the registry office. He designed the Christian Baptist Church in Newmarket in the center there. And on the right-hand side, he designed the Presbyterian Church. He designed many houses. So he was definitely significant to the community. And although he just lived north of the community, clearly he was important to Newmarket. So that raises the question, well, what if you bring in an international architect? So we go back to the Flying Box in Toronto. And Will also is one of these starchitects. He's a star architect that was brought in to design this. He's based in the United Kingdom. He had an office in Toronto, mainly to deal with the OCAD edition. But I would argue that he is significant to the community because of his worldwide contribution. And he was able to make part of that worldwide contribution in the community. So, you know, you may have an architect that is outside of your community, but if they've got a wealth of experience and a wealth of work, then I would argue that they are significant to your community. An example of that locally is that Carnegie Library in the village of Durham. that architect was based in Guelph, but I argued that he was important to the community simply because of his contribution, that one of his works was in that village. Now, the question comes up about later architects. What if a later architect was involved in the building? So you've got my house on the left-hand side in 1968. And that's how it was found by Napier Simpson Jr., who was an architect, an early restoration architect based in Thornhill, in the Markham portion of Thornhill. And his work was, you'll see examples of his work throughout South Central Ontario in the 1950s and 70s, through to the 1970s. He died in a plane crash working for the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board. And he died in, I think it was Labrador. He was out there investigating the site. Anyhow, you have this early log building, 1837, as it appeared in 1968. And then you have it in 1970, what he did. And his works are in the Ontario Archives. So these drawings, I had a copy of these drawings, but there were also copies in the Ontario Archives. And there are about 15,000 of his drawings in the Ontario Archives, along with associated notes and photographs. And I'm sure that he did work in Caledon. So the question comes along, is this architect important to the building, to the property? And in this case, I'd argue, yes, it's an early example of restoration architecture. It's not exactly what we would do today. So for example, the dormers on the building, he's reinterpreted those dormers. So instead of hip roof dormers, we've now got gable roof dormers, but he kept the dormers, he kept the alignment of the windows. He was imaginative in his design for the veranda, which I found out later actually wrapped around the full house. And he put in this rather large sliding glass door that wasn't there in this side wing. So, you know, I'd make a case that a later architect involved in the building who was important to saving that building and maybe readapting it should be considered as being a criteria for designating the building.
Wayne?
Yes?
It's Valerie again. My neighbor's home was restored in 1970 by Napier Simpson. It's the McFall Cottage, which dates to the early 1840s, or parts of it date to the 1840s. So what you see now was his work in joining two separate buildings to create one single family home. And yes, it is designated.
Yes, again, so yeah. Simply the fact of his being involved, I think, is criteria, but you have other criteria that property appears to be meeting. So it's something you should keep in mind. I've had disputes with other colleagues on this, that later alterations aren't justified aren't justification for designation. In this case, it's the architect who was doing the alterations is a significant factor. Artists. It's not often I come across an artist who was significant to a building, but I came across this with the O'Keefe Center. I'm not sure what it's called now, but there you see it on the left-hand side, modern architecture. So the architect that designed that building was significant, but the artwork on the inside is significant. And this was done by York Wilson, a Toronto architect. So there you see the mural up on the wall, and it's associated with the fact that it was a theater, still is a theater, and it's illustrating the 7 lively arts. So there can be artwork on the inside of a building that can be a criteria for designating the property. In Victoria, British Columbia, the female artist. Anyhow, she painted the attic ceiling in her house with her artwork. The property is designated because of the paintwork that she did on the ceiling on the inside. That must be a challenge to conserve. And in Newmarket, we had a house where one of the criteria was the interior wall paintings. When the house was first built in the 1830s, an itinerant artist came around and painted a number of pictures on the wall when wallpaper was expensive to get. They were later covered up, and then the wallpaper was removed, and these paintings were revealed, and one of them was a group of dogs playing cards at a table. I think you've probably seen that piece of artwork. Anyhow, one of the reasons we designated that building and included the interior was the interior wall paintings.
Just as an aside, York Wilson was my neighbor when I was growing up. I met him selling Girl Guide cookies. He was a lovely man.
Right, right. Well, there you see one of his pieces of artwork being celebrated. Yeah. I'm sure he's done other works around the city of Toronto.
Yeah, there was one in the Manulife building at St. Clair and Yonge. He's actually considered Canada's foremost muralist.
Right, okay. So St. Clair and Yonge.
It's turned into a condo or the LCBO now, but it's where Franz used to be, a few doors over, one of those modern buildings there.
Okay, okay.
There's one in there. I know he had a thing going with Harold Town that his wife never forgave Harold Town for, because he got the credit she thought York Wilson should have. Okay.
Okay, builder. Again, whether a builder is associated with a building may be justification for designating a property. In this case, I was doing a property in Sharon. It's called the Temple Farm, and in fact, it's associated with the Sharon Temple, although it's a separate parcel. And in fact, it incorporates elements. These posts on the veranda come from a separate temple building that was demolished in the early 20th century. But they had several buildings, the Children of Peace had several religious buildings on the site. So that was one justification, but the builder was also important. And this was a case where I was doing research on the property and was talking to the property owner, our property resident. He had a life lease on the property. It had been sold to a developer, but he had a life lease, and I don't think the developer believed he would live as long as he did live, but he lived for years, and he couldn't do anything with, the developer couldn't do anything with the building. But the issue came up, the municipality said, is this building worth designating? So I talked to the owner, and the owner gave me a piece of paper and said, here, his father had engaged a builder from Newmarket to build the house. And there you see part of it. And it's Isaac Rose. And this is dated 1915, I believe, yes. And it's a description, it's a contract to build this house. And he describes in there the type of building that he was going to build. So I knew he was associated with this building, this builder. He was actually the designer of the building. There was no architect involved. So it was a talented builder. And in fact, I was able to find from local newspapers and my own experience in Newmarket that he had built a number of buildings in the Newmarket area in the late 19th and early 20th century. So a very prolific builder, and this was a good example of his work. It survived largely unaltered and still continues in that condition. So this is a case where I've used a builder. Okay, so I have never encountered a theorist significant to a community. If you ever find one, let me know. I'm not quite sure what they mean by theorist, but anyhow, it's possible that for the Sharon Temple, David Wilson, who was their religious leader, was the theorist, and he designed the Sharon Temple based on religious theories. So you might say that there was a case of a theorist designing a building, but that's the only one I know of. So it's unusual.
In Europe, they consider philosophers important.
Pardon?
In Europe, they consider philosophers, for instance, important. I was in a house in the Dordogne, in a small village that was actually listed because an important philosopher had lived in it 200 years ago.
Okay, now that yes, that would be sort of associative value. So if we go back to theme, event, belief, or person, yes, person in that case. So that's the association. But in this case, it's saying the work of a theorist. So unless that philosopher designed the building, you wouldn't argue that it's a work of, but it's associated because he was a later resident, in the same way that the veterinary surgeon was a resident of that building on Highway 50 in Caledon. Okay, so we've moved on to contextual value. And in this case, it says it's important in defining, maintaining, or supporting the area character. So this is an urban example, a set of 19th century row housing. And each one of those units is important. If you take out one of those units, you ruin the row housing. So that's a very tight local example of being each unit having contextual value. It'd be like knocking out your front teeth if you took out one of those buildings. In the rural area, this is an example that I found in Simcoe County. And I was dealing with widening of County Road 27, formerly Highway 27. So this is west of Barrie. And this is a case where I've said that all of these buildings taken together, so it's one property, but all of the buildings taken together are important in that it defines, maintains, and supports the agricultural character of the area, because they show the evolution of farming on this property. Now you've got a farmhouse that's been reclad in brick. Nevertheless, the mid-19th century farmhouse is still there. You've got a gable roof barn that has been raised up. And so it's a grain barn. It's been raised up on stone rubble to make it a livestock barn. So you've got a very early barn from the mid-19th century. And you've got here a very early shed implement shed associated with the property. So all of these together help explain the agricultural character of the area and show the evolution of agriculture in the area. The big problem I have using this, so this is an area that is going to remain agriculture. So it's very much important to that character and maintaining that character. The challenge comes if this land was going to be converted to urban use. What if the characters of the area is changing? And in cases like that, I often say that if the building is significant for other reasons, then it's important in explaining and defining the evolution of the character of the land from rural to urban use. So it often presents a quandary in rural areas. This particular criteria, particularly where change is occurring, and if it's going to remain urban or rural, that's fine. But if it's going to be converted, it's problematic to use this criteria, in my opinion. Okay, the second one here is physically, functionally, visually, or historically linked to surroundings. And I'm not sure, if we go back, I'm not sure how different that is from the first criteria. And again, I've run into problems, and often when I've said it's important in defining and maintaining and supporting the area character, I've also come along and said it's physically, functionally, and visually, historically linked to the surroundings. Okay, this is a case where I was engaged to do work on 209 Main Street in Newmarket. And 209 Main Street, as you can see, is the center part of a block. So this was called the Millard Block. It was burned down in the 1850s, rebuilt in the late 1850s in brick to make it fireproof. And this shows the property in the 1890s. So this building, this unit 209 is physically, functionally, visually, and historically linked to its surrounding. It's a part of that block, and it's part of a larger Main Street context. So it would also meet the first criteria that I showed you before in terms of contextual value. There's what it looked like in 2018. So you can see 209 in the center there. It's had a lovely stucco job done to it. And I worked with the owner and I said, I think the bricks are still underneath there. And sure enough, that was what was found. Brickwork needs some repair. And he's reinstated the semicircular headed windows in the upper story. And we're now in discussion about how he's going to treat the storefront down below, because a steel I-beam was put in there to hold the weight of the upper story. So, and the steel I-beam is flush to the brick, so somehow it has to be covered up. So, but that is very much a case where it meets all those values. It's on Main Street, it's part of a building complex, it's part of that two-story construction that occurred on this part of Main Street. For the rural area, again, going back to County Road 27 and the widening of it, I was asked to identify which properties may be of heritage value, as the municipality had not designated or listed any and had no municipal heritage committee. So this is Essa Township. And I said, well, this cemetery is very much physically, functionally, and visually and historically linked. You can find grave sites in there to the 1850s. So it's very much a part of this rural landscape, as is the farmhouse that you find on the right-hand side. And you can see it was, I estimated it to be built about 1868. So all of it, it meets all those criteria. We come to landmark, and it just says it has to be a landmark. So you have to interpret, what does landmark mean? And in this case on Main Street, we said the tower from the post office is very much a landmark. It rises up above, so it's visually prominent. And in fact, when the bells and the clock worked, it was also an audible landmark in the area. So that's obvious. It's a tower. It rises above everything else. This is a church in Milton, close to Britannia Road, very close. This is the shoulder for Britannia Road. And there we have the Presbyterian Church that you saw an older picture of earlier, and the cemetery. And I said, this church is a landmark simply because all the rest of the area is farming property. It's an unusual structure in this farming property, in that, you know, you're dealing mostly with barns and farmhouses, and then all of a sudden you drive past this church. So it is a landmark. It's set close to the road, so you see it. You have no option but driving by, seeing it, and also this cemetery is a very visual element. So there, it's not something that rises up, but it's something that's very close and it's very prominent when you go by it. Other examples of landmark where they terminate a viewscape. So you know, a classic example of this is the tower on Old City Hall in Toronto. You look up Bay Street and that's what you see. It was designed purposely to terminate the view up Bay Street. So you would look up it, see this tower, and in fact, Bay Street bends around the building to the left. Similarly, the legislative building were built so that the traffic would have to circulate around the Parliament building. So clearly, it's very much a landmark, terminates that view as you drive up University Avenue.
You know, the land it sits on is still the property of the University of Toronto?
Yes, yes. And the university building, before it was torn down and became the Parliament buildings, it was temporarily used as a lunatic asylum.
Oh, really?
Some people claim it's still operating as a lunatic asylum, that site. So anyhow, another landmark is it can bifurcate a viewscape. So you can come up and all of a sudden you're confronted with this building. Perhaps the Parliament buildings bifurcate the viewscape. Definitely this building does, the Coffin Block or the Flatiron building. And there you see the building that used to be where the Flatiron building is now. And it used to be called the Coffin Block, I guess, because it was shaped like a coffin. So it was replaced in the early 1890s by the Gooderham building or the Flatiron building. Here you see it here. And one of the reasons that it really becomes a landmark is it's got this tower element to it. It has become much more of a landscape now, a landmark, because of the backdrop of modern buildings. So you've got this red brick building, which in a sense is dwarfed by the buildings in behind, but it's still a landmark simply because you come up to it and it presents a very strong view of itself. So those are all the criteria. I've gone through all of them as best I can. And my final word or two on this or more is do not rely solely on contextual values to justify listing or designation. So landmark, for example, a landmark is important, but I can show you landmarks that, in my opinion, don't justify designation. And some of those landmarks are water towers, just strictly utilitarian engineering structures. They stand out, but in my opinion, they're not worthy of designation. The standard engineering design. So you should look at other values, particularly the first two groups of values. Can it meet some of these other criteria? And I mentioned the conundrum that I enter into when I start looking at contextual values in a rural area and whether a farm property, simply because it's been there a long time, is that sufficient to justify designating the property? In some cases, I don't think it is. I think you have to have better justification. Otherwise, we would be designating every old farm property that continues to exist. So don't use just contextual values. The more values, the better. So you saw the house on Highway 50. There were a number of values there. In that case, that was also a landmark because the Highway 50 bent around the corner, bent to the northwest, and it was very visible in its former site.
Can I just add something to that, Wayne?
Yes.
It's Joanne here. The Robinson House was empty for years, and it was part of Paul Coffey's dealership.
Right.
And we looked for options. It was designated. We looked for options on what to do with it for a number of years. Anyhow, finally, we had a developer purchase it. We had to move it. So we moved it north, not too far, and he put it at the entrance of his subdivision. He restored it. The outside is stunning. The inside is equal because they've used a lot of the trim, the fireplace around, etc. They've reused inside, and it's just a real success story for us.
Yeah, good. That's great. I was involved in providing the justification and reasons for designation of that property structure. And as a consultant, you sort of hand off the work to the municipality, and you don't always know what happens. And in fact, I was driving down behind the coffee dealership out to go out on Mayfield Road in Brampton, and I saw the house is gone, and I thought, what happened here? But I sort of searched around and found, yes, it's been moved. So that's great that sometimes relocation is required to save a property. So this third point here is be certain you can defend the values you've selected. It's important that they have to have justification in the documentation and the visual evidence that you can find. I've encountered myths associated with properties, And to give you an example, my house, which you saw a picture of, is on the shores of Lake Simcoe. And the myth associated with my house is that there was a tunnel from the house out to Lake Simcoe so that they could get away from the Indians when they attacked. Entirely a myth. First of all, the lake level between the lake and my house, you could never structurally build a tunnel out to the lake. The second thing is the Indians on the reservation near us are our friends. They were our partners in the War of 1812. And in fact, they got the land because they were our allies. So they would never have attacked us. So that's an example of a myth. And sometimes it's appeared in print about my house. So you got to be very careful about using things like that can't be documented either in records or visual evidence. So make sure you can defend those values and do your research. Your conclusions about values could be contested. When the new legislation is proclaimed and listing comes about, the owner has the right to go to council and complain to council about the listing. So the council could come back to you and say, well, why did you recommend listing? So I believe it's important. You've got to be prepared to defend those values, especially when it comes to designation, because you could end up before the local planning appeals tribunal having to justify why this property is of heritage value and how the property meets those criteria. So that's my presentation. If you have any further questions, I'd be glad to deal with them.